It's episode 13 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM.
It's really cool to do because you get to meet a lot of people. Like, I've met so many people that I never would have come across. And once you talk with somebody, you're like, hey, we're at least on friendly terms. And so if I see them out somewhere, the grocery store or something, it's like, oh, hey, and then you got an acquaintance now, and then possibly a friend. So it's really cool just to build those relationships that I just never would have done without the podcast.
Jason Burton created a local podcast for Evansville, Indiana. Then he invited other podcasters to join him in telling the stories of their community. Today, the Evansville Podcast is a network that's making connections with those who live there and even receiving an award for its impact on the city. I'm Jason Norris, and this is Podcast Local, a show about telling the stories of your community. If you're a local podcaster or thinking you might like to become one, Podcast Local features interviews with local podcasters from around the world, offering insights and advice you need to get started or try something new. And a network is an interesting way to podcast local. Let's explore that strategy and hear about Jason Burton's journey into local podcasting. Support for Podcast Local comes from the Satchel Podcast Player that helps local podcasts get discovered. Find out more at satchelplayer.com. I was curious if the Evansville Podcast is your first podcast.
Yeah, that's my first podcast, is the Evansville Podcast.
So why did you decide to start not only a podcast in general, but why did you start a podcast about Evansville?
I had just started a software development consulting company, and I thought the podcast would be a good tool for me for meeting people and for marketing.
What year was that?
That was 2013, the end of 2013.
And you thought this would be a good way that you could promote your business as well as do something interesting.
Yeah, I needed a good hook to get in with people. I kind of focused on small business owners, and I was trying to meet them as well for business, but also to talk with them on the podcast. Because that was the initial goal, was to get to know these small business owners and kind of pick their brains on how they got into it. Because running a business is hard, and it's like, why are you wired that way? And what kind of struggles did you have? How hard is it to do in Evansville? That kind of thing. But it morphed into other things as well. I wasn't ever expected to do events and things like that, but the event people found me pretty quickly. They got to promote their stuff, so. Which I don't mind doing because I get to know the cool stuff that's going on.
Well, I got a question. Since that was your goal at the beginning, did it actually help your business?
Yeah, I was able to meet, so many people networking. And it helped me personally just to be able to talk to somebody. I'm a software developer, and those are not necessarily known as the most outgoing people. And I definitely was not a people person. So it's kind of, changed a lot in how I approach things. I can look people in the eye and carry on a conversation now. And
that's cool.
Yeah. So it really, it's positively affected me, even if the business is no longer there. Just, I took a real job. So it's just I took a corporate gig, just to work with a business that has insurance and, benefits and paid time off, that kind of thing.
Yeah. There's very little paid time off when you're starting a business.
No, turns out.
So I noticed, I went all the way back to your first episode, and I was listening to little bits of that, and I've noticed a significant change in the technical quality of it. And I was just wondering, can you sort of give a quick story about how you started in the equipment you used and where you are now?
We started with the Yeti USB, the blue microphone. I think that's pretty common for podcasts to start out kind of that way. I've seen a lot of people do that. And that's a great microphone for starting out, I think. There's little technical knowledge you need to do. You just plug it in and go, and that's what I needed. I was in a conference room, usually at a co-work space. That's where I recorded most of my episodes at the start, and the quality, the room wasn't set up for sound or anything like that. So the quality is not necessarily great. Hopefully the content was what kept people around. But then as I got along, I'm a kind of a gadget guy, and sound stuff is interesting. So I would collect microphones and just information. I'm always curious on other podcasters' setup, so I would always research that stuff. ended up getting a couple of Heil PR40s because I saw that Leo Laporte used them and he recommended them and he always sounded great. So I thought, well, if they can help me, that'd be great. And then, I just kept collecting equipment and, progressively getting better until last year, whenever we formed the podcast network. One of the guys on the network is a sound engineer. He has his own recording studio. And so he was able to teach me a lot of stuff and loan out some equipment. So our sound got infinitely better in the last year. We bought a home in the historic district in Evansville, and we have a carriage house. And inside the carriage house, above the garage, there's an office I use for normal daytime work, but also transform some of it into a little studio where I can bring people over and kind of control the sound a lot better. So I think there's a lot of things that go into making it sound better. I learned some tricks on Adobe Audition to make it sound better as well. So yeah, this last year has been quite the journey on getting the sound to be much better. And I think the sound quality is really good right now. So I'm pretty happy with it.
Are you recording, by the way, with the call recorder in Skype, or are you recording a separate?
I'm doing it separately. I'm going straight through GarageBand. When I started out, I wanted to do it pretty cheaply, so I kept GarageBand was the thing I used all the time. And then once through my company that I had an Adobe license, and I found that Audition was a part of it. So that's when I started playing around with it. And I really like editing in Audition, but I still like recording in GarageBand. I had some technical issues. Audition kept stopping recording on me when I was recording, which was not awesome. So I don't trust it as much right now. So that's why I went back to recording in GarageBand. I'm able to record separate tracks for each microphone in there, so I can still split things out if I need to. And then I merge that down, go to Audition, and do all the fancy stuff over there.
So tell me about Evansville.
Yeah.
Are you born and raised?
Yeah, I was born here, raised a little outside, but in the greater Evansville area, we call it. It's like a tri-state area. We're in the southwest corner of Indiana, like right in the middle of a lot of bigger cities. So we're like 3 hours distance from St. Louis, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Louisville, Nashville. All those cities are kind of within that 1.5 to 3 hour range. But we're like the third largest city, I believe, in Indiana. Around, I'd say in the cities, like 125,000 people, maybe. And then the greater area that they call it, the metropolitan area, is like 300,000 people. So kind of a smallish city, big town, small city kind of thing. It's funny because I've heard Mark Bologna that does the New Orleans podcast Beyond Bourbon Street, and he referred to their city as Crescent City, I believe. And I was like, wait, I've heard our city called that, so I don't know.
Oh, wow.
I don't know who got there first, but we've been growing a lot lately. There was some time where it was all very suburban kind of mindset, but here in the last couple of years, I think there's been a lot more push to be more downtown and grow that, and just kind of there's been a spark here lately with people trying to get things going in a positive direction. So I hit the right timing on starting the podcast because I'm able to kind of see from the ground up of things starting out, the like a lot of the interesting things that are going on. When I first started the podcast, I lived just outside of Evansville in a city called Newburgh, or a town called Newburgh. And it was very suburban, and I was really apathetic towards Evansville. Didn't really care either way. I mean, it was fine, but I didn't have an appreciation for it. But once I started the podcast, I started meeting all these people that were interesting and doing interesting things in the area. And that kind of developed I won't say love, but a strong like for the area now. That's why we moved down to Evansville, because we're like, we need to be a part of the happenings, and the downtown area is really starting to pop. So that's why we moved downtown.
Yes, that does make a difference when you finally start to get to know the people in your community.
Yeah, and it's the whole concept of maybe bloom where you're planted. And my wife says that a lot. You're here. I mean, you can complain about it, or you can do something about it if you don't like it, right? So We want to be hopefully participating in whenever someone has a good idea, or if we come up with an idea, we hope people participate with our idea, but we can't just sit around and complain that there's nothing cool to do and then not do anything whenever it shows up. Not long after I'd started the podcast, there was an article came out that said Evansville was one of the most miserable cities to live in the country, right? And we're like, they measured it by some, I don't know what all they used, but they talked to some people. It was one of these polls, but they also kind of measured like things going on in the area and all this. So like, is it really miserable? I mean, is it? And B, if it is, then are we just going to sit here and do nothing about it? Or are we going to do something about it? Or are we going to move? Because if it's really miserable and no one's going to do anything about it, then we should probably find somewhere else to live. And we decided that we would stay here for a few years and, give it a shot. And there were a couple other like-minded people that we didn't even really know each other, but they kind of had the same opinion of it. We started talking on Twitter and decided to meet up. And then there's been a lot of interesting things come out of that meeting. But like I have the podcast, and one of the other guys he has brought TEDx to Evansville. We've had 2 TEDx events in Evansville now. And another guy started a free concert in the park. We have an all-day concert that's totally for free, and we bring in acts from all over the country now. And yeah, so there's just things there's a makerspace was started out of that group. Yeah, it was interesting just to see that some guys were like, we want to do something, and we want to prove that either A, that we're not the most miserable city, or we're going to change it if we are. So, and we're not the most miserable city anymore. So we're not on that list anymore for some reason.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, we didn't have a great rep. We were the most miserable city, and we're also one of the fattest cities at some point. So yeah, it was pretty awesome here a couple years ago.
Well, maybe your podcast is the thing that's making all the changes.
Right. That's what I want to say. Yeah.
Well, can we talk about money?
Sure.
How is your podcast doing on the monetizing and the sponsorships and that sort of thing? Yeah,
we're always thinking about, but not quite completely executing on the money thing. I didn't want to have sponsors because I don't want somebody to tell me what I can and can't say. And I wanted to have a track record. I can't just take somebody's money. I want to provide them value. So I wanted to make sure I built up enough credibility. Towards the end of the year last year, we took on a couple sponsors, and we had, like an affiliate set up just to kind of play around with it. We were charging low just because we were trying it out. And then with the network forming, we've really tried to hammer that out where we're going to, be official and provide the add information sheets and things like that to, it's like, this is what we're expected. How many spots do you want? How many times on social media will you be shared? That kind of thing. What kind of script do you want? That, so we're trying to figure it all out, and I never know what to charge people. So that's been a difficult process because I always feel like, well, I wouldn't pay that, but then again, I don't have a business right now. So,
well, I can understand, especially when you started, it was more of promotion for your business,
right? And
meeting people. So in a sense, it's sort of like your business. This whatever expense it did for took for the podcast this is more like advertising for you. But on the other hand, now that it's more focused this way, I can see sponsorships being useful and helpful, especially paying for all that equipment that you need.
Right. Yeah, and I think we provide a good value because we are local, and we have definitely an interested audience, a targeted audience. So if someone here locally wants to target somebody locally, I mean, we're a pretty good option, I believe.
Well, Podcast Local has a sponsor, Bo York, who had created the Satchel podcast player. Have you heard of that? Have you tried that player out?
I have heard of that. Actually, a guy that was on episode 2 of mine came back from some conference. He lives here, but he works for Singularity University. I'm not sure if you've heard of it or not, but he was an amazing person to talk with because at the time when we recorded, this was like over 3 years ago, and he was talking to me about self-driving cars and disruptive technology that was coming. And he came back and he messaged me and he's like, hey, I met this dude that does this local podcast players called Satchel. You need to check it out. So I got in on it a little bit. I think it was in the summer last year that I found out about it. And yeah, I signed up immediately. It sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, I really like to look for local podcasts, and I found a few that it's interesting. It's not everyone, because I go to Podcast Dallas. Not everyone in there who has a podcast is showing up, but because you have to actually go register at satchelplayer.com in order to get your show to show up. But to be able to look, and it's like, oh, there's another local show. Or even if it's not local, it's like someone lives just like 10 miles away and they do a podcast too, which is kind of neat.
Yeah. I don't know if it's like this where you live, but here in Evansville, I would say we have a pretty good podcast to population ratio. There's a lot of podcasts popping up. A way to find that would be great, because it is interesting just to hear people perspective that live in your area. Even if it is a national topic, I still think it's usually an interesting take on that.
Yeah, and so clearly if anyone wants to do anything like that to connect, you could use Satchel Player as a way to do that. And you can find more information at satchelplayer.com. If you find someone in your area, one or two other people who are doing podcasts, then you might actually want to consider what Jason Burton is doing with his podcast, because it's not just Jason Burton's podcast anymore. No. You have made a network out of your local podcast. Can you tell me about that and when this idea came to you?
It's a good question on about when the idea came. So I had a podcast, and my wife had a podcast, and then another friend of mine was starting a podcast, and another friend of mine. So it was like, we should probably do something together. So we knew each other before, and we all kind of live actually very close here in downtown Evansville. And we thought it would be cool to do something. We could help each other out. We didn't really have a set agenda on what that meant, and we're still figuring out what that means. We've actually been meeting more regularly lately to kind of figure out how to grow our network, how to grow the audience, that kind of stuff. But the initial reasoning was just, we like each other. Let's help each other out. See if we can figure this thing out. It really was about the extent of it. Here lately, we've been more organized, and I think the benefits actually have helped me because, like I said earlier, with Clark, who does the sound, he does Clockwork Nights, which is he does the sound recording. He's really helped, like immensely helped me with the sound quality of my show. And then Josh, who does Brewer's View, he's the head brewer of one of the local establishments. He's a good guy to know just in general, but he's brought some organizational skills that have really helped us. And then my wife she's very good at keeping me on track. and see, I'm an idea guy, and she's the doer. So it's a good, it's nice to have one of those for idea guys, because I can't, I would never get anything done. But she's very good at helping me follow through on things. And it's been good because I feel like I'm more accountable to produce a good show, because, their reputations are we're kind of linked at this point. So their reputations are on the line. And then I'm able to help push them too, to make sure to get things done. I know we've helped technically, like I've done the podcast longer so I can answer questions on when they're setting up things, because I've submitted to, RSS feeds everywhere. So I know which ones to go to, that kind of junk that is not exactly the fun, glamorous side of podcasting. But, if you know how to do that, then we're able to help each other out and kind of promote each other's shows. They have different audiences than I do, and vice versa. So it works out to help just kind of get the word out more on each other's shows.
So the way it is set up, each of your shows, do they have their own RSS feed, or is it the idea we're all coming to Evansville Podcast to listen?
Right. Right now, the four of us have our own feeds. And then we have a fifth show that it started on my podcast. It's a politics show, Politics Aside, and it will be rolling off into its own feed here soon. It was more like a pilot season, maybe, just to see if it worked. I kind of like that model where we try out for a few episodes and see if there's an audience, if there's interest. That way we don't have to spend a bunch of money on setting things up with a feed and everything, and then it just not working. So I think that's more of the model we'll probably try in the future. Everybody has their own website, but I kind of filter everything through Evansville Podcast's website. That way, if you're a fan of my show, you can get everybody's show, and it's just easier just to send everybody to the same spot usually. But I can link to everybody's own page and episodes through that website. So we're still trying to figure out if that's the best way to do it. But at this point, I think that it's the way to go. I like one spot shopping,
Yeah. Well, tell me about the 4 shows and in a little more detail.
Yeah, so Clark's is called Clockwork Nights. His recording studio is Clockwork Sound, so it's a play off that. He wanted a kind of an old school nighttime radio station vibe, where it's just this guy talking about music, and he covers a lot of the hardcore and punk music that's in the area, and he kind of grew up in that, so he knows a lot of the people that went through that. We had a pretty decent hardcore scene. Apparently, I didn't know any of this until Clark's podcast came along, but we in the early 2000s. So he talks to a lot of those guys. Plus, he talks to the recording artists that come through his studio. He had a live episode, which was really cool, where the artist he was recording with performed a couple of songs, and he interviewed them to talk about where the where did this song come from and all this stuff. And it was a really cool experience. So hopefully we'll do more stuff like that with his show. And then the Brewer's View, which just relaunched. Josh retooled it a little bit from last year. 4 times a week. It's a different style. There's, one episode will cover baseball, one episode will cover basketball and hockey. It just kind of splits it up. One's football, one's soccer. What he does is he covers it from a Midwestern perspective. There'll be some national news just because there's, national's usually important, but he wants to cover more Midwest and local sports because we lost some of our local sports radio here within the last couple of years. So he's trying to fill that gap right now. And then my wife's podcast, which is probably better than my podcast, which irritates me, is called the Beyond Repair Show. And it's not necessarily local focused. It can be, and a lot of times we have local sponsors. We do have sponsors for that, but it's mostly just somebody giving us some beer from a local brewery or something. But her show is a listener question show where she'll have a special guest every time. It's a different guest each time, and we'll take calls or emails, calls being voicemails, questions from listeners about either home repair or life advice or relationship advice or anything you wanted to ask us. And it's a pretty funny show. It usually starts out with a couple of home repair questions and then immediately goes into some of the craziest questions. So it's a fun one to do. Yeah, that one. And then my show is Evansville Podcast, which just covers things going on in Evansville, people who are doing cool things or people that are running businesses, starting out businesses, that kind of thing. So I just kind of cover a general Evansville blanket of whatever. It can be anything I want it to be, fortunately. So that's the nice thing.
Well, that's really nice.
Yeah, it's generic enough. We had recently the local public radio station. We kind of partnered with them, and they had a live call-in show that they did that covered Indiana and Kentucky basketball. And after it was over, they would give me the MP3 of that show, and I just threw it up on our feed just as to see what kind of numbers we would pull from them.
Is that the Red Blue Hoops?
Yeah, that's Red Blue Hoops.
Oh, okay.
So we did that, and they only did it from the beginning of the year to middle of March. So there's probably 10 episodes of that. So that was interesting, just to it helped our, boost our numbers without me having to do a whole lot. So that's always nice. And then I got to do a thing on their show, or not their show, but on the station. They had asked if we could come in every once in a while and kind of give a update on what we've been talking about on the network recently. It's sporadic times, but it's been interesting too, because I get a lot of people that come up to me just like, I heard you on the radio the other day. Like, oh, cool. Thanks. Listen to the podcast now.
Yes.
Right. You can hear more of me.
Well, what are your plans for the network going forward?
Yeah, we just talked about that last night, actually. So we're hammering out our sponsorship details so that we will hopefully grow that a little more. We're not like greedy or anything, but we definitely have costs that are associated with the show. And we would like to, get better equipment or get some swag, that kind of thing. And it all costs money. So there's sponsorships will be happening pretty soon. We also talked about growing the network. So there's a couple of shows we're going to approach to see if they want to come on the network. We'll see how that goes. But we're trying to figure out what that means, because there's 4 of us now, and we have to figure out how to split sponsorships and all that fun stuff. So it's a lot of weird businessy stuff that I wasn't expecting to get into on the when I started the podcast. But it's fun. It's kind of cool to, if I didn't like these guys, then it would be a little irritating probably to handle some of the money side. But they're fun to hang out with. So any excuse to get together is good. And then we've got a lot of shows to promote and pump out, and just kind of be more consistent. I know that's for my podcast, that's the thing I've not done at all, is be consistent. I know a lot of people with their podcasts like to have, like every Tuesday we're have a show out by noon, and it just doesn't work for me that way. So we're very sporadic. I'm not sure if that hurts or helps my numbers, but at this point I can't imagine finding a schedule that works. It seems like every time I try to do that, then there's like somebody calls me and wants to be on the show because they have some, event popping up, and it's like, well, okay, let's do it then. I hate to say no to that. So yeah, but as far as that, we're trying to figure out, we need to get a logo for our network, that kind of, mundane stuff that I don't think about. Yeah. And we've got some events that we want to be a part of. There's some cool events that happen in Evansville, and we're going to try to be more involved with those. We want to be a presence at the event, and we've been playing around the idea of, setting up a tent and recording some podcasts at events, that kind of thing, just to mix it up a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, though, clearly you are successful because you just won a major award.
Oh, gosh.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, we were nominated. There's a thing called Leadership Evansville here in Evansville, and they highlight and help different organizations or people doing things to help the community. And we got nominated for one of the categories. It was for public and government as an organization, and we actually won. So, which was very weird to win something like that. We were very ill prepared. My wife and I were in attendance, and we got up and had to make the long walk around the stage to pick up the award. And it was just like, what is going on here? All these people. But it's been cool. We kind of play around with telling everybody we're going to be insufferable now and say we're award-winning show. But yeah, it's quite an honor. We're very humbled actually to be nominated even, but then to actually win it's pretty cool.
Do you know how the nomination process worked?
Yeah, individuals in the community can nominate whoever they want, and we got nominated by someone that just spoke about how diverse our topics were, and just, the shows on the network being just, all different, but helping the community and spotlighting what was going on to promote Evansville. And so that's, I think the way he worded it probably helped us win.
Such a cool idea, I think, the idea of bringing more than one show together in a community and networking together, but being able to produce this local thing. But it's a bigger thing than if you're just you trying to week by week get a show out.
Right. Yeah. And it does help. I mean, if I were to feel like I said earlier, maybe that, I'm more accountable now, because if I feel like, I just can't do a show this week, but then I'm like, oh, but I got to meet with those guys soon. And they're going to be like, well, why didn't you have the show this week? So yeah, that it really helps to get focused on that.
All right. So if you were to advise someone, hey, you can actually, I'll tell you, you can specifically advise me. All right.
Okay.
So I started that show in Fort Worth, and then we left. All right. So now we're in a different part of the Metroplex, and we're just north of Dallas. It's a city called Richardson, and next to Richardson, there's some other cities like Plano and Garland. It's an interesting place. So, I was just thinking that I would like to get another one started, but I'm trying to narrow down my focus. Like, should I start just with Richardson, this one city, about 110,000 people? Or should I make it larger, include Plano, which is a couple 100,000 more, and Garland too? Or should it just make it Dallas, just say Dallas in general, or North Dallas, and cover everything? What would you say to all of that?
Man, yeah, I've wondered about that too. Because, when I started, I thought I'll cover, greater Evansville area, which is, a few counties. It's like southwestern Indiana, a little bit of Kentucky, a little bit of Illinois. But I haven't been able to get out of Evansville because there's so much going on once you start digging. I'm not sure if you'll encounter the same thing. Most likely you probably will, where there's just so many good stories in the one spot. The problem is, if you're looking for download numbers, does that limit you? And that's what I try to think about every time is, being named Evansville Podcast, does that limit me or does that help me? So yeah, I don't know if I have the answer for that one. Because once you dig in, you might find there's plenty of content just in the one spot, but I want to make sure that everyone knows about, what's going on in Evansville, in the area, not necessarily just the people inside Evansville. So that's a tough one. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Been a tough one for me too.
Mm-hmm.
In what areas would you like personally as a podcaster to get better?
Oh, I would love to know how to ask better questions. I'm always curious about that because I feel like at the time, I'm always like, I'm asking stupid questions, but I have a bad habit of, if I already know the topic or if I know something about, I'll kind of gloss over some details that maybe other people don't know just because if it's like, say if it was something we were talking about technology, like I had a guy on that was a cybersecurity expert and I knew a little bit about some of that. So I glossed over some topics that probably we should have gotten a little deeper into just to help other people know about it, just because not everybody knows about these weird technology terms. But I just assume because I I know that. But it's just one of those things where I'd like to control the interview a little better. I know when to dive into a thing and know when to not just meander around. I say another thing I would really like to get into is a more narrative story. That's really hard for me to even wrap my head around it at this point in my life. But I'm a real big fan of that style, and I would like to play around with that a little bit on my show at some point. But man, that is a lot of work. So it's very intimidating for me.
Well, I think a really great book for that type of thing is called Out on the Wire. It's by Jessica Abel, and it's the storytelling secrets of the new masters of radio.
Oh.
Now, what Jessica Abel has done, she has basically turned this into like a graphic novel. It's her interviews with people like Ira Glass and others who are like folks from Radiolab. And what she did, she went and interviewed them about the process of doing the stories that they do, which for the most part, they're those narrative stories that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. That's cool.
Now, I've asked you a lot of questions. Is there anything that I haven't actually got to that you would like to share with other local podcasters?
Yeah, the best advice that I think I have on local podcasting is just to do it. I've known people that want to do a podcast, even recorded a couple things, but then they just didn't follow through. But then they're always like, I need to do it. It's just the fact is you got to do it. There's two pieces of advice that I've always heard that I really like is just start. Because that's like one of the hardest things. Once you're started, then it gets a lot easier. But then two is you're going to be terrible for at least the first 10 episodes, most likely. Or at least you're going to think you're terrible. Looking back, my first 10, I apologize to the guests that I had. Just you figure things out. You get more comfortable on the microphone. It's still the weirdest thing to do intros and outros because I'm alone in my office, just staring at a microphone. It's just weird. I need someone here to talk to. Fortunately, I've got a poster that was given to me for Christmas. It's Big Trouble in Little China, and it's got Jack Burton on there, and I can look at him and talk to him if I need to talk to somebody. So that's helped. But
I think he's a Burton too. So.
Yeah, he's in the family. But just starting is like the biggest thing, I think. And it's really cool to do because you get to meet a lot of people. Like I've met so many people that I never would have come across. And I know people, and once you talk with somebody for, I usually talk with people 30, 40 minutes, and then you're like, hey, we're at least on friendly terms. And so if I see them out somewhere, the grocery store or something, it's like, oh, hey, and then you got an acquaintance now, and then possibly a friend. So it's really cool just to build those relationships that I just never would have done without the podcast.
That's Jason Burton of the Evansville Podcast, a network of podcasts for Evansville, Indiana. Find out more about his network at evansvillepodcast.com. I enjoy seeing this concept of local podcasting continuing to grow. There are broadcasters, news writers, and even people with no prior experience in media getting out there, talking with their neighbors, and telling the stories of their community. Would you like to start your own local podcast or podcast network? Tell me about it. You can even pick up a free on-the-go guide with different ways you can podcast local today. Get the guide, subscribe to the show, share your own local podcast, or tell me about the one you want to start. All at podcastlocal.com. I'm Jason Norris, and thank you for listening to episode 13 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM.